Today's participants are Leslie Lieberman, and Jean Costain. We joined their conversation in the faculty lounge.
And the reality of what it's like sort of as a working journalist, and I'm really fascinated by that.
Oh, there are several similarities, and you've hit on a subject that I absolutely adore and that I hope to do something on academically, and that's, as we talked informally about this huge gap, this chasm between journalists and academicians.
Right.
And it's an unfortunate gap because ideally both of them are supposed to be truth seekers, socially involved, depicting and helping people understand what happens around, writing history, although journalists are historians on the run rather than historians as such. But they don't communicate, they don't talk.
They don't, there are no professional organizations where they get together and actually...
Well, yeah, that happens. But there tends to be some tension there. And one great example of it is chi-square and social scientists as opposed to green eye shades professors. The green eye shades professors are supposed to teach the skills, and they value the profession, and they don't want to get into the critical stuff or the political economy of media or any kind of theoretical realm. They just want to, they value the profession and they want to teach for the profession. Right. And then there are people who, I guess I'm in their ranks, a defector from the journalistic ranks. I want to look at some of the larger questions in journalism. And there's that gap. And then there's the gap between journalists themselves and people critical of the media, like Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's fascinating. I saw him once. And this is what intrigues me about your question. What I want to get into, and I hope I can explore even on camera.
But he's a scientist. I mean, he wouldn't consider himself, well, a linguist, initially as a linguist.
No, that's not the point. I remember this interview seminar where Chomsky was with an elite group of Canadian journalists, the tops in their field, and some of them very, very good journalists. And they were talking past each other. I mean, the gap between them and the inability for them to adjust their linguistic behavior to each other and talk to each other about their truth-seeking and their missions for reform was appalling. Chomsky wouldn't deign to come down to the journalist level, or what is up and down, I'll leave that for others to speculate about. And the journalist wouldn't try to come up to his conceptual level. It was a disaster. Chomsky was particularly, I thought, a little bit arrogant in this situation, and the journalist thought he was from Mars in some of his theorization about the media. That's unfortunate. That is sad, because a lot of media studies professors really value what journalists try to do, for obvious reasons, because there's so many commonalities between the two professions, if you want to call them professions. So I think, to finish off the answer, Jeff Greenfield, who passes for sort of a pseudo-intellectual on CNN or wherever he is as weekend pundit, after reading Chomsky's reflection on media manufacturing consent, says, where in the hell does this guy come from? Mars? What is he talking about? For a bright journalist not to try to understand where he's coming from, one of the most brilliant men in the world, although he's radical and on the far left and anarcho-syndicalist, not to try and have access to what this person does in a very meaningful way is sad, silly. But the journalists are wrapped up in an economic system that demands a certain way of performance in this commodified news culture, and academics have the time and inclination to look a little deeper.
Reflective, So as a journalist then, is it your job, and now you're training journalists, is it your job to train them to remove their own, or educate?
No,
that's my medical background. We train physicians to educate them to remove their personal interests, emotional, intellectual interests from the job of doing journalism, the reporting jobs.
No, I'm a
heretic. That you're not supposed to insinuate your own.
No, I'm a heretic. I want them to look at what the premises are for their professional gear. What objectivity, fairness, and balance that they're supposed to strive for. I mean, journalists are one of the last few professions who still cling to the notion that they can be objective, when most of the research and speculation about objectivity indicates the best you'll ever do is strive for it. And I'm wondering if objectivity is not one of the biggest crimes we have in media, because it cuts off so much outside of a narrow political parameter. So, okay, I'm not going to sell them on a new way to practice journalism, but I mean, damn it, before you go into this maelstrom, think about what we know about your profession and the way we train you. Think about it. You know, remember the mission of academe to learn how to think critically about what we do. And if I can accomplish that, that's not too bad. For instance, news writing. I teach a course on news writing. In 1947, one of the most critical documents that ever came out on media was the Hutchins Report. And one quote in the Hutchins Report was to teach a news writing course in a university, I'll paraphrase, ridiculous in a liberal arts environment to teach this vocational course. And I teach the course and I agree with the Hutchins Commission. So I try to talk about a macro dialogue about what we're doing in news writing and how it limits us, and then teach the skills. So you know, it's a contradiction in terms, but let's think about while we do, and then let's learn the skill of how to do it. So, and some of them are very confused because they're used to the trade school model of learning news writing. But I said, look at news writing the way it exists now. There's no historical context to any of your stories. We live like an MBA or a business from quarter to quarter. We have no institutional or social memory in our news. Is it not, shouldn't we have a little bit of a discussion where we learn the who, what, where, and where, and an inverted pyramid about the inadequacies of what we're doing now? They don't agree. They think I'm a little bit crazy. Yeah,
it's almost, they're very anti-historical, I think, or ahistorical. And your research and interest have been really looking at the sort of history of journalism, or the history of I guess it was radio production, and seeing some real changes.
That's my aspiration.
And I'm really concerned in this day and age whether we have more constraints on what's reported. I see that as a consumer, mentioning television news when I turn on the news at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Not very much is on the news about international issues. I keep getting lots of weather reports, of course, because of our recent hurricanes. But I'm really feeling that there are large areas that should be covered that are not being covered. So I'm wondering if there are new constraints. And the other, and looking at that historically, and the other piece that I know that you're very concerned with, that I think's wrapped up with this, is also the kind of values, because I think what's happening is related to values. So have the values changed historically that lead to what's being reported now? Man,
those are monstrous questions.
Oh, okay.
But I'll carve off one slice that's very appropriate to this discussion. My mentor, Hanno Hart, who's one of the leading, if partially unknown figures in media studies, says and James Carey at Columbia University is another one, who says, journalists have no history, and people who don't have a history that values their contribution don't know themselves, and don't know their potentialities, and don't know the ambitions they could realize in their own profession and craft. When you look at the standard textbook, you see the great white man theory of history, where the Edward R. Murrows and the Henry Luce and William Randolph Hearst, this traditional linear progress through new technologies, through the great white men who figured prominently, and 99.9% of the work was created by journalists who worked, and how their role was infected by the political economy of media, new technologies. So when I did my dissertation on labor reporters, the last of the labor reporters in the Canadian setting, it was so interesting, because when you started to talk to them about who they are, you realized they had no foundation. They had no understanding of themselves as a profession, because journalism history had damn well ignored them. It was ridiculous. There's been an incredible renaissance in labor history, and you wouldn't have to go too far if you're a working class person to really get scads of good material on what working class means in the American context, but journalists know. And James Carey wrote a famous 1974 article that said, get off your ass. Do some real work, journalism historians, that reveal who these people are and their importance. And that's the key. So they'll have a foundation for realizing that they fought certain battles for professionalism and so on. But structural changes in the media, as another related topic, I mean, it's no surprise in our lifetime to see the increasing commodification of news. You see the sliding off of foreign content to satisfy consumer demands, to see O.J. Simpson trials, Gary Condit, and Peterson. Who gives a damn about Peterson and that incident? I mean, beyond normal human empathy for that poor woman.
I know, it's been amazing.
We're spending day 53, Peterson trial. Give me a break. Our public airwaves are increasingly being populated by bottom line considerations. And do you think journalists aren't affected by that political economy of media?
I'm sure
So they have no history. The political economy of media is increasingly closing off their options in terms of how they can be truth seekers. So what you're saying is real. And when 9/11 happened, to finish the thought, this is a barometer of what's happening out there. NPR's listenership more than doubled because Americans, the most literate population in the world, ran to NPR to get some content, ran out to buy books. And I think both of those were symptoms of the inadequacies of our media to satisfy the demands of this democracy. You know, and I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's a great question.
And I'm not sure I agree with you because, at least for me, and I don't read a lot of history, my history is created by the journalist, by what I read in the newspaper, by what I read in Time magazine. So that is my history.
Yes.
So how realistic is that? Is it really bereft of a lot of depth? I mean, obviously you've got editorials as well as just straight reporting some of the facts. I have.
It's a good history, but the point being, and related to an earlier point, is that the quality of that history on the run that we go back to LexisNexis to search to launch our research ideas in many cases, many are arguing is diminishing by commercial considerations, by the fact that 5 media entities, 5 media corporations own some 85% of what we view, read, see in sitcoms.
Yes,
that's the stark reductionist political economy model. It says he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I know that's too simplistic in many respects, but does it have an impact? When you hear that CNN and one of the major 3 broadcast networks want to amalgamate their newsroom operations to save $150 million and dump many, many broadcast journalists and reduce the diversity of the national news diet, then you know something is happening. That's one manifestation. To have journalists converge in their roles in radio, TV, and print to work across platforms. Does that have any impact on the journalism's autonomy, the quality of the news, and professionalism? I had Donna Reed of the Tribune Company come in and lecture to my kids one class about her convergence effort, a leading edge effort to teach journalists to work across platforms. And I asked Donna in the class, I said, aren't you worried maybe about the professional status being diminished by being forced to do? She said, no, we give them a 6% raise.
Said, and that's enough an inducement.
Aren't you worried about maybe their autonomy? No. I says, well, what about the newspaper guild in Florida? Doesn't the union for newspaper report? We don't have one in Florida. Then I cut off that conversation about the possible negative impacts of convergence of jobs, gave it up as a lost cause because she didn't want to engage with it, and certainly her corporate employers weren't interested in those more esoteric questions.
So what are the pressures, though, now in terms of journalism and reporting? I'm thinking particularly about the scandals over the last year where we revealed that Jason Blair, for example, and the sort of mea culpa that we were getting from the news editors who actually left. I'm not sure whether they left the industry, but they certainly left their positions. And sort of forced retirement.
At the New York Times.
At the New York Times said, I am guilty, I should have had more oversight. So they resign. So you have a number of people resigning, you have a lot of retractions in our major newspapers, some over individuals with these revelations, but also over Iraq in terms of the weapons of mass destruction. Lots of retractions are saying we should have looked harder. We should have questioned more.
That's true.
So what's happening there? Is there a different consciousness that's
Go back to Janet Cook. You remember the fabricated story about, what is it, the 12-year-old heroin addict? Dan Rather's recent problems with the supposed fake documents, Jason Blair. You know what media companies and news organizations are doing? They're looking at the Gallup polls, and the Gallup polls don't give them very good news. The reputation of news people has often been down around used car salespeople. And there's been a movement in journalism over the last 10, 15 years led by an American academic. Jay Rosen is best known for public journalism. But behind that public title for a more involved, capable journalism is a communitarian ethic that they're trying to embody to remedy this awful reputation the news media is gaining for poor quality with the public. The public increasingly doesn't seem to trust them. And when these eruptions take place, I think I even underestimate the magnitude of a Jason Blair or this Rather incident on the slowly sliding reputation of media. But you know what I think? I don't think the public really can articulate, most of us, or understand why they're feeling this way about the media. But if you study it and you see the trajectory over the last 20 years of commodification in news, salacious, sensational news you can use, as opposed to the cod liver oil they used to feed us, the stuff that we had to choke down to be citizens. You see the spread between citizenship and consumership. And I really think, and I don't think it's that reductionist to say that consumerism is on the ascendancy and it affects news in a very tangible way, and it's a dangerous, dangerous gamble we're playing. And that gets back to the gap between the academics and the journalists. They're not talking to each other, and they're both very many commonalities. And to break down those barriers is something that I would love to do. To get a series I'm proposing is to get 12 of the leading academics to really talk about all of these major issues and maybe why this gap has always existed between journalists and academics who study journalists and have a lot to offer to them.
But aren't the prevailing factors, the sort of politico-economic factors, going to trump some of these other, you know, let's be more historical, let's look at, you know, let's give people a broader base of the news.
Oh yeah. Very excellent point.
So what are the chances? I mean, I'm sounding rather negative, but what are the chances of actually getting a change, or who's going to be listening and will it have an impact?
You've hit on the biggest issue as far as I'm concerned. Talk about it, do research about it, but how can you stop or slow down this rushing freight train 90 miles an hour that's leading to the increased commodification and the news you can use, and even propose structural changes that might improve the media. One of the biggest critics is Bob McChesney. He's the new kid on the block, Noam Chomsky Jr. He's a critical scholar, very critical, and he's taken up the criticism of the right. The right says, well, hell, you've pointed out all the warts on our media system. Give us a prescription for what ails us. And he's taken up that cudgel in an effective manner and said, well, what we need is to find a way to create other media venues. In Canada and Britain, you have a combination of commercial and public broadcasting, and I think there's a tension there that increases the vibrancy of the public sphere. So at least he's talking about solutions, but he's looking at an onrushing train, and you rightfully point out the political economy of media, the way it's going now, would be very difficult to change its trajectory. And the only small peeing in the wind answer is to create maybe scholarship that gives journalists a history and therefore an evaluation for themselves and what they might do to improve the lot of the media. But that's, again, might be just a little flimsy for the job that needs to be done.
There's almost no time to contextualize it. I mean, I think that you talked about a rushing train, and that's the sense that I get, the sort of convenience and the necessity to get the news encapsulated and to the public. So I'm thinking about another, you talked about the sort of 3 platforms, but what about, I mean, I have a number of colleagues, and I do this myself, you just sit there at your computer, you're there anyway, and you bring up the New York Times, and you read the headlines or some sort of, you know, first paragraph of the story, and that's it. That's you sort of digest that little bit of news in a very convenient format. Or various political organizations that send you pieces, so I can learn about Bush and Kerry's stance on different things in a very encapsulated form while I'm sitting there. What about that, about the use of computers and getting the news out?
Well, you know, I read an article, funny you should mention it, about the new blogosphere. And I've been having blogs, you know, web blogs, or blogs, they're so called. This is an exploding phenomenon. And I swear, reading a piece of journalism 2 days ago taught me for the first time the significance of this new phenomenon. And it answers your question in a way. These blogs have been responsible for revealing many big stories. I can't think of them right at the moment.
They're very quick, right?
They're very quick, but it's attracting journalists, renegade journalists, academicians, and others who are going in there and, for instance, looking at the Swift boat boat captain's allegations, and then going and finding the information and putting those contacts in the web. They've broken many stories.
Yes.
What you have here is a bunch of unofficial journalists who are doing fantastic research that the journalists don't have time to do on deadline. And you may well be creating an environment in there that would fulfill the promise of what the internet was supposed to be all about, for freedom and political expansiveness. But this woman's article, I think Marquez is her name, was just a fantastic articulation of what this phenomenon is all about. You're getting in phenomenal people in there who are doing the role of what journalists might do if they had the time and resources to do it. Journalists are like historians on the run. You and I have the wonderful benefit of sitting back and reflecting and synthesizing and doing research, and you know, what a beautiful thing we have. You know, we're 180 degrees separated from the journalists and their deadline pressures. Well, these bloggers are doing what an ideal investigative journalist could do. So she was arguing in this article, watch out for these things. They may show an incredible amount of promise for foisting a conscience and a work ethic on journalists. I don't know. I know it sounds wild, but it's the first time I understood.
I didn't see that relationship.
I'd never seen that before, and I'm supposedly an academic, and I keep hearing from people that you've got to get into this. You've got to take a look at this phenomena, because and she was arguing in this article, to finish it off, that it might have a real ripple effect on the way journalism is practiced, because these people are doing the legwork, and they're good people. Some of them academics, renegade journalists, and others doing real research to beef up the stories that aren't done well in our mainstream media. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading things on the web which began with the preface, well, you'll see this in tomorrow's newspaper. Here it is 24 hours in advance. And it's true,
I think what you're seeing is real, and journalists don't have time to look at it. You know, I can understand their defensiveness when someone sits down across the table with them to try and talk about these issues, because they feel they have some kind of professional patina surrounding them that makes them impervious and invincible to some kind of deeper thinking about this subject. But they can't get away with it for me, because I spent 12 years in radio, television, and print. And I know about the artifice, and I know this phony patina and glow of a news person is just that, something we sell the public. But they don't have time to look at it, and it must be scary to slow down and look at Chomsky's thesis, to look at political economic implications of the commodification of news. If we could find a way to boil that term down to something a little more digestible. They don't have time to look at that, and they don't want to, because I think they feel like Jeff Greenfield and saying, who is this guy Chomsky? Is he from Mars? They feel that if they look deeply enough, they might not like what's there. So this chasm between academics and journalists, I think, is one of the most intriguing things. I'd like to move in that direction with whatever research I do, leading to, you know, these interviews being part of that.
I took some training from the fellows in charge of news media for Centers for Disease Control. So he coaches the scientists at Centers for Disease Control on what to say and how to control an interview situation, everything from what sort of books you should have on the shelf behind you and how do you structure that environment to what you say. And basically, he was saying, well, you can't really be a scientist. People don't want to hear about the ifs, ands, and buts, about the caveats. They want, journalists want it clean, they want something quotable, they want a lead, and they really don't care.
You've
Just
got it.
Give
that's it.
And no, so who's caring, I guess, is the question.
And this is why Jeff Greenfield of CNN said Chomsky didn't appear in the mainstream media more often, which was complete bull. The reason he doesn't appear is because he's too politically unpalatable for the mainstream media.
I would agree with that.
But Greenfield goes, you know what I think? I think he can't talk in sound bites. Like there's some kind of magnificent virtue in summing up the world in 15 seconds and getting the hell out. But their Rolodex contains people who know the rules and play by the rules. Right. And those rules aren't very expansive about what you can talk about on television.
They're not.
So you've hit on one of the issues that separates the two in a very unfortunate manner. But what the journalists have to be aware of, that some of us have been where they are. So you can't sell us on this phony patina and wisdom that seems to strike you like a bolt of lightning and not other mortals. I know what that is. But I think there's going to be lots of fun in this particular subject if I do it, if I move in that direction.
On the other hand, you've got the blogs, but you also have journalists who are writing books that become bestsellers. And these books tend to be more politically oriented. Or Woodward, and you've got very they're historically based, and they've become enormously popular. So my sense is that at least some of the public are very interested in having journalists lay out the history from that particular perspective, and the role that that individual journalist played in conveying, either creating or conveying the sense of historical events to the public.
Journalists have a reputation for writing smug, self-serving, name-dropping biographies. But there's another genre, like the turncoat Bernard Goldberg, who wrote the book about liberal bias in the media. One of the most slim, useless volumes I've ever read in my life. When you compare it to Eric Alterman's book on so-called liberal bias in the media, he has more than one page of footnotes than this man has in his whole book. I went out at the behest of one of my graduate students who invited me to a live taping where Bernard Goldberg was being interviewed in front of 500 blue-haired Republican ladies.